So it ended up being 15 minutes instead of 10. This is what always happens. So let's go ahead and start again then. Yes. Oh, that's fine. Yeah. So let's get started again so we can conclude at 12, right on the dot at 12:30 and do our lunch break. So let's go on to the next slide. There's a few slides now that kind of relate what I was saying earlier about the two states of mind that are counteracting these two demons, the twin demons that we just looked at. So the two states of mind, again, that we mentioned earlier are conventional bodhicitta and ultimate bodhicitta. So let's go to the next slide and look at some brief explanations of these. Conventional bodhicitta is the altruistic intention to attain enlightenment for the welfare of all sentient beings. So again, there are techniques that we learn to generate that, but this is a mind that takes this aspect of aspiring to become a Buddha for the sake of others, aspiring to develop ourselves fully to achieve our greatest potential so we can benefit others. So it has kind of these two aims to it. The main one, as I mentioned in the motivation, Rinpoche always emphasizes that it's for the sake of others. We're doing this because others need us to help them. Others, need our enlightened mind and so on. But we have to become a Buddha to do that. So let's go to the next slide, and it just touches briefly. As I said, I just don't feel like we have the time in this weekend for me to do. We've got sun on the screen. I don't know if everyone can read what's up there, but there are two main techniques that are taught in the Lam Rim in the stages of the path. Again, in the person of great capacity. These two techniques are the sevenfold cause and effect and equalizing and exchanging self and others. Now, we saw that reference to equalizing and exchanging self and others in what Glenn Mullen said, right? I think it was Glenn Mullen, or maybe it was Thupten Jinpa. Anyway, we saw an earlier reference that the Lojong teachings are very much associated with that technique. That technique also involves the practice of Tonglen that I mentioned briefly earlier, that we're going to be using as a regular tool in the mind training teachings this weekend. The first technique, though, sevenfold cause and effect, the essential elements of it are that we need to feel a sense of closeness to other beings. So we think about them having been in a role where they gave us great care and attention, particularly the role of having been our mother, though obviously any being who has been involved in our care or concern could be an equal measure of that. But we want to feel this real kinship with other beings through that technique, feel like they were somebody who cared for us really greatly. And so therefore, we want to repay that kindness. Therefore, we're going to generate a wish to benefit them in these ways, to help them to have happiness, to help them to be free from suffering. And to do that, we have to become a Buddha. So the techniques are taught in the Lam Rim for generating through the first technique, sevenfold cause and effect, but then also through this technique called equalizing and exchanging self and others, which is revolving around this concept of exchanging our tendency to cherish ourselves, focus on ourselves, to focusing on others, holding them to be supreme. And that's why it's called first equalizing, getting self and others equal, and then exchanging, putting the priority on the benefit of others. And so this is where the techniques in Lojong and mind training are primarily coming from, is this, or together with this technique of equalizing and exchanging self and others, where we're directly combating the mind of self-cherishing. And then, of course, in many texts, they allude to a combined method where we bring both of those together. And it's an 11-step method where we take some of the steps from the sevenfold cause and effect and we add them to a good number of the steps from equalizing and exchanging self and others. And we end up with this very rich technique for generating bodhicitta. If you have questions about that or are curious about that, I can certainly direct you to some texts where you can examine those further. But I think I'm going to move on from here because, like I said, if I go further, then it's just going to take up a lot of our time. Let's go on then to the next slide, which is ultimate bodhicitta. I discussed this earlier, but it's the wisdom directly realizing emptiness. By directly, I mean non-conceptually. That is inspired by that altruistic intention. So in answer to what Steph said earlier, you may have somebody who's realized emptiness if they were on the Hinayana track, if they were on the path to just their own nirvana, their own liberation. They would definitely have to realize emptiness to accomplish that goal and realize it in a non-conceptual way. But for the person who is on the Mahayana track, who from the very beginning wants to become a Buddha for the sake of others, they would cultivate this altruistic intention, wanting to become a Buddha for the sake of others, and then on the basis of that, they would eventually realize emptiness directly. Again, those of you, I actually explained this to Adam over the break, so I'll just mention it briefly because most of you in the room are familiar with this. On the Bodhisattva path, there are 5 levels. They also say there are 5 corresponding ones on the Hinayana path, but we'll talk about the Mahayana. We enter that into the 5 paths with the uncontrived mind of bodhicitta. And the first path, the first level, is called the path of accumulation. Rinpoche is calling it the path of merit these days. But it's where you kind of accumulate the strength of your understanding of emptiness and your compassionate wish to benefit others so that you have enough force behind it to go to the second level, which is the path of preparation, where you prepare your mind by analyzing more deeply emptiness to eventually have the direct realization, which occurs on the third level, the path of seeing. So ultimate bodhicitta is attained on the path of seeing, because we entered the path with this spontaneous, uncontrived bodhicitta, we accumulated merit, we prepared our minds accordingly, and we eventually have that direct realization, where there's no longer any differentiation of subject and object. The two kind of merge into one with an experience they say is unparalleled and it's irreversible. Once you achieve that, you are entering the stream and moving in the direction of enlightenment, liberation, what have you. The next level, the fourth, is called the path of meditation. We could call it the path of familiarization, where you continue to meditate on emptiness, accumulating greater and greater positive potential merit to remove more and more of the dirt in the water, more and more of the obscurations. You eventually remove all of what's keeping you from having a state of liberation, but you go beyond that to remove what are the obstacles to omniscience that are keeping you from becoming a Buddha. When you remove the last of those obstacles, you enter the fifth path, the path of no more learning. School's out then. You never have to go back to school. No more learning at all. You've learned it all. You become an omniscient Buddha at that point. So this fifth path is not really a path of a bodhisattva. It's the resultant state that one achieves by practicing the path of accumulation, preparation, seeing, meditation, and then eventually achieving that state of no more learning. And Adam's question had to do with the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, where we say gate, paragate, parasamgate, bodhi, soha. These are in reference to the 5 paths. So gate, or gone, is the first accumulation, then gone again for the preparation, gone beyond for the path of seeing, where we cultivate this ultimate bodhicitta, and then gone far beyond, which is where we strengthen it and remove more and more of these obscurations, and then bodhi, path of no more learning. Again, you may have gotten that already in your teachings on the Heart Sutra. But so this is what we mean by ultimate bodhicitta. Let's go to the next slide. Let's do this last slide and then we'll see. We'll see to your question is what I mean, not see whether you get to ask a question. Ultimate bodhicitta is developed by the bodhisattva using many analyses. Among these, dependent arising, the king of reasonings. And I'm just mentioning this because we'll see that when we get to the final verses, that this is the approach that Dharma Rakshita takes in this text. Okay, yes, I'll see your question. What are we doing? Where are we on my hand? We're like over here, floating out, to the side of our hand. We haven't yet entered the path because technically we don't have uncontrived bodhicitta. Unless you do. Maybe I always joke that maybe we're just talking about Buddhas could be anywhere. You all could be Buddhas manifesting as students to help me develop my mind, So thank you. I'm sorry it's taking me so long, but yeah. So we don't know who's a Buddha, but I'm assuming if you're like me on struggling with just putting these teachings into our minds and meditating on them and what have you, we're kind of off to the side yet. When we get this uncontrived bodhicitta, you technically then become a bodhisattva. You get your little card in the mail, and and it says, official bodhisattva. And then you strengthen your bodhicitta and your whole practice as you go through these various levels until you achieve that result. But it is sequential. There are demarcations of when you move from here to here, and when you move from here to here, and here to here, and so on. Yes?
So how does that relate to taking the bodhisattva vows? Can you actually take them
without uncontrived bodhicitta? Yeah. The question, can you take the bodhisattva vows without uncontrived bodhicitta? Well, it does seem that they confer the bodhisattva vows to all of us who don't have uncontrived bodhicitta. So the answer would be yes. And I think we'd be expected to uphold them as best as we can given that. Now, if you had uncontrived bodhicitta, it'd be a lot easier to maintain your bodhisattva vows, obviously. I don't know. I mean, I've never had a teacher say that we're not officially receiving them. Same would go for Tantra. Tantric teachings do come into play a little bit in this text, not so much. This is mostly a sutra teaching coming from the more common teachings of the Buddha. But we get that question sometimes too. Are you really taking an empowerment, a tantric empowerment, if you don't have uncontrived bodhicitta, you don't even have the meditation that would be necessary to do the full empowerment at that level? Well, I think we have to assume that we are. We're gathering together with these amazing beings, and they're doing this as long as we're not like completely asleep during the whole thing. I think we have to assume that we are doing it. Yes?
Uncontrived bodhicitta is both the aspiration and the engagement?
Doesn't have to be the engaging. It would have to be at least the aspirational. So what Steph is speaking to is another division of bodhicitta where we talk about aspirational versus engaging, and those are both varieties of conventional bodhicitta.
Where would you say that engaging?
Well, engaging would probably happen very shortly after aspiring. It would seem that you would have then, the engagement in the practices of the bodhisattva. Sometimes they even define that as, having the bodhisattva vows in your continuum is part of engaging as well. But I would say, do we have engaging bodhicitta before we've had uncontrived bodhicitta? I'm not so sure. We could say, again, we're mirroring it by taking the bodhisattva vows. Just like we're mirroring aspirational bodhicitta, or aspiring bodhicitta, by meditating on bodhicitta and through those techniques I mentioned. Yeah. But I do think we have to assume we hold the bodhisattva vows because we've taken the ceremony, whether we have uncontrived bodhicitta or not. So, Steve. Oh, okay. All right. Let's keep moving. We're going to go into a little bit of this is that debate that I was talking about around the relationship between these two minds. Let's go to the next slide, which actually asks this question: what is the relationship between these two demons? So we saw Glenn Mullen saying, if it were not for the eye-grasping habit, self-cherishing would not exist. Well, this brings up a query. So what do we say about the person, because this did go into the question that you had, Steph, about the person who has gone through the Hinayana path. Again, the Hinayana path has a similar 5 levels, but the goal isn't Buddhahood. The goal is just one's own liberation. It's what we would call one's individual nirvana or solitary peace. And the Buddha taught this path for those who can't bear the burden of the Mahayana yet, That's a lot to take on, to say this Messiah complex, like I was saying, I'm going to rescue all beings and take them all to enlightenment. So if you have some practitioners whose mind is really just thinking, I just can deal with what's on my plate and I want to get out of samsara, they will practice this path, and on their path of seeing, they will realize emptiness directly because they have to in order to remove the afflictions, the ignorance that is keeping them bound in samsara. For them to achieve this state of nirvana, liberation, that is their path of no more learning, they have to do that. But it's said that they still have self-cherishing in their minds. They still have some, because of that focus on their own well-being, they haven't yet gotten free from the first demon. They have resolved the second demon of self-grasping, but they haven't yet broken free from self-cherishing. So the question to Glenn Mullen, or anyone who propounds this, again, this was written many, many years ago, and I'm not in any way questioning Glenn's intellect or abilities or anything. It's just that this is frequently how they are taught, that from self-grasping, self-cherishing arises. If it were not for the I-grasping habit, self-cherishing would not arise. Well, there's a problem there, because the people who accomplish that Hinayana path achieve the state of arhat, or foe destroyer, having attained their own liberation. They have completely gotten rid of self-grasping, but it said they still have self-cherishing. So where does that come from? So I'm sharing with you something that came from His Holiness's book that some of you have read, Buddhism, One Teacher, Many Traditions. Let's go to the next slide and I'll read this. He here calls it the self-centered attitude, which is what we're calling self-cherishing. Considers ourselves the most important, whereas self-grasping ignorance misapprehends how the self exists. Aside from the self-centered attitude's grosser manifestations, which are obviously detrimental, its subtler aspect seeks liberation for ourselves alone. So this is kind of the best presentation I've seen around differentiating a grosser level of self-cherishing, which is where most of us are operating from. You know, even us on the aspiring to be on the Mahayana path, we have a lot of self-centered attitude that is creeping into our lives. The subtler one, though, is distinguished from this, as His Holiness says. Let's go to the next slide. He says, in general, this subtler version is not an object of abandonment. It is an unmistaken mind that motivates Shravakas, who are the hearers who practice the Hinayana path, and Pratyeka Buddhas, who are the solitary realizers who practice the Hinayana path, to fulfill their spiritual aspirations, generate virtuous qualities, and attain their own liberation. All admirable activities. So they engage in virtue on the basis of this mind that is focused on their own welfare. Again, a very subtle form of self-cherishing, but it's driving them to achieve their own liberation. How wonderful. I mean, we can all rejoice that we have less beings in a state of suffering when they achieve that goal. So His Holiness was essentially saying, this is not an object of abandonment then. We would actually say at that subtler level, it's an unmistaken mind. Let's go to the next slide. He continues and he says, however, self-centeredness is an object of abandonment for those following the Bodhisattva path to Buddhahood. So for us sitting in the room who are aspiring to achieve Buddhahood, want to become Bodhisattvas, that's why we're studying the self-cherishing mind in this aspect of saying it includes the grosser manifestations, but it even includes the subtler ways that Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas are driven to their own liberation. Because we find that to be anathema to Bodhisattva attitude, to the bodhicitta, because we want to go beyond that self-concern. We don't want to become narrowly focused on me getting the hell out of samsara. It's rather me achieving Buddhahood for the sake of all beings. So His Holiness is saying it is an obstacle for those who want to achieve that goal. The self-centered attitude is neither an afflictive nor a cognitive obscuration, meaning it doesn't keep us bound in samsara. It's not a goal for achieving liberation to abandon that mind, nor is it something that is a cognitive obscuration or an obscuration to Buddhahood, an obscuration to omniscience. It is not a pollutant, and it is not the root of samsara. The self-grasping ignorance is. So, this self-centeredness, again, that is this subtler version, is not a deluded mind. It is a mind for those on the Hinayana path to actually achieve great virtuous goals. But for the Bodhisattva, we want to abandon it because it gets in the way of our greater goal of achieving Buddhahood. Then he goes on to self-grasping in the next slide. He says, self-grasping, on the other hand, is the root of samsara and an afflictive obscuration that must be eradicated to attain either liberation or full awakening, enlightenment. Let's go to the next slide, and then we'll see if there's a few more slides on this, I think, and then we'll see if there's questions. The self-centered attitude and self-grasping have neither a causal relationship, one does not cause the other, or a same nature relationship. If one exists in a person's mind stream, The other doesn't necessarily exist. Nonetheless, we would say that for most of us, they're coming together in the same package. You know, we're getting our self-grasping and our self-cherishing, two for the price of one. You know. So those of you who've studied a little bit of debate or kind of understand the logical ways of working with two different phenomena that are usually set out in Tibetan Buddhist debate, and this is even set out in logic and Western philosophy, and what are called the Venn diagrams, right? And so there's a Venn diagram that could symbolize the relationship between these two states of mind, and it would be the interlocking circles. You have over on the one side the one circle that is self-cherishing, and then on the other side the circle that is self-grasping. The self-cherishing mind does have instances that are not together with self-grasping. That's like these Hinayana practitioners, right, that have gotten to that level. They've removed all their self-grasping. All they have left is this very subtle self-cherishing. Those over here that have self-grasping would be anyone who hasn't done the work to remove that self-grasping, hasn't achieved either arhatship or some level on the bodhisattva path where they've done that work. But there's an interlocking part of those two circles where you have people who, the ones who only have self-grasping would be those who have developed their bodhicitta to a degree where they no longer have any self-cherishing, but they still have self-grasping, they haven't removed it. I'm sorry, I was explaining that a little wrong. But then when you have these two interlocking circles, who's in the middle? Who's in that section in the middle? Would be most of us who have both minds still present. We have a mind of self-cherishing at a subtler level perhaps, but certainly at a grosser level. And we have our self-grasping mind because that's what's running the show. That's the ignorance that's at the root of our suffering. Then you have people who are outside those circles. They don't have self-grasping, they don't have self-cherishing. And that would be the high-level bodhisattvas and the Buddhas, you know, who definitely have removed that self-grasping, no longer have any self-cherishing in their minds, and they are, you know, on the way to Buddhahood, very close to that state, or having achieved that state. So this is the way that we would look at it, is that it's that the answer in debate would be four possibilities. That there is one thing that is self-cherishing and not self-grasping, one thing that is self-grasping but not self-cherishing, one that is both self-grasping and self-cherishing, and something that you could say is neither of those two, which would be the mind of a Buddha or a high-level bodhisattva. Yeah.
That's what I question.
Uh-huh.
Saying that, the example of something that is neither a mind of self-cherishing or a mind of self-grasping.
Right.
A Buddha I can get, but the high-level bodhisattva, I thought that even at the very high level,
Yeah.
eliminating those cognitive obscurations.
But eliminating the cognitive obscurations would mean that you're no longer getting rid of self-grasping. Self-grasping is gone. So on the path of meditation, you do achieve at the 8th level. Having completed the 7th ground, on the 8th ground, you then have all of your self-grasping removed. You're equivalent in terms of that wisdom aspect to the arhat. But you then go on to remove on the 3 pure grounds, the 8th, 9th, and 10th grounds, all of the cognitive obscurations, which is what's blocking you from becoming a Buddha. Those are the imprints of that.
But surely that still has some sort of cognitive basis on which you could say that the self-grasping mind is still...
No, we would say no. No, it's not active. You don't have any active self-grasping. Actually, they say for the bodhisattva, once you reach the path of seeing, you don't really have manifest self-grasping. You would have it in your continuum still. But once you achieve the 8th ground, you no longer would certainly have it in your continuum in any way, nor would you ever manifest.
So what exactly are you doing then?
Well, you are relating to things in a very truthful way. You understand reality at the conventional and the ultimate level, but you're no longer with any pollutant of ignorance at all.
So what's still blocking that?
The block, just so those of you, again, the cognitive obscurations, as they were called here, or the obscurations to omniscience, are the imprints from that ignorance that are in your continuum that manifest in the form of the false appearance of things existing intrinsically, externally. There's that false appearance that is still with you. It's still with the arhats, and it's still with the high-level bodhisattva.
I think there's a misunderstanding that I had in my mind about something that you were working, that the bodhisattva was working on all the way through up until
Yeah.
the path of noble and the result of external.
So the first 7 grounds, the Bodhisattva removes all the afflictive obscurations, which are the operative ignorance, the self-grasping, and all the other crazy delusions that are built on that, and all the karma that is supported by that. Once they've removed that on the 8th ground, they still have this subtle appearance of things existing on their own out there. Again, I'll get into that when we get to this final verses, and we can talk a bit about, what's operating there, how things appear versus how they exist and are grasping at a false appearance.
So what happens at the path of seeing then is simply, although obviously it's not simple, it's simply the non-conceptual realization of emptiness, which itself eradicates a vast amount of afflictive obscurations, but not all of them.
At the path of seeing, it really just gets rid of, they say, the acquired ones, the ones we've intellectually acquired. And then you remove the innate as you go through the remaining grounds till you get to the 8th. Yeah, this is getting into like a whole nother subject. This is like salam, grounds and paths. but it's important to have this understanding. And again, for basic program, it's kind of strange because in the basic program, I think it's usually taught as part of the Heart Sutra. But even there, I mean, sometimes you don't get into this level of detail. But yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah. Oh, we haven't been doing the microphone. I'm sorry. We keep going back and forth, and it's hard for me to remember to repeat questions, so I apologize to those listening to this if it's not clear what the questions were. Yes, Adam.
So I'm wondering if there's a difference between self-centeredness and self-cherishing. Are you using them?
I'm using them as interchangeable. This is just His Holiness's word for that. Yeah, self-centered attitude.
Okay. I had one more question, which I seem to have forgotten now, but I'll ask you later.
Yes, please do. Yeah, Amelia.
Don, I heard once that those who were seeking liberation, but just individual liberation, once they achieve nirvana, eventually it's all going to convert into being fully enlightened. Somehow they are going to work out for themselves that there is still a self-centered nature, and eventually they are going to release themselves from that as well. Yeah. Does that really apply?
What happens is that my understanding, and I always had questions about these practitioners when we were studying in Italy, and I never got satisfactory answers to all the details on these beings. But when they leave this corporeal form, because they will achieve the state of arhat or foe destroyer, probably in a human form with a human body, or something approaching that, and they leave from that life. Their mind continues on in the state of peace, solitary peace, nirvana. They say that they abide in a form of like a mental body that is, in Tantra we would say it's sort of the subtle wind together with that consciousness that is in this peace of nirvana. There will be some karma that is generated from that keeps them in that state for some period of time, probably quite a long time. And eventually they are stirred out of that. A Buddha kind of brings them out of that awareness and says, you have not yet done all the work. You have to still remove these cognitive obscurations. You still have to become a Buddha because you haven't achieved your full potential. And so then these beings have to come and enter the Mahayana path by generating bodhicitta, by developing this, removing that subtle self-cherishing that they have and generating concern for others. And they've already generated the full wisdom wing in terms of removing the afflictive obscurations, but they have to cultivate all the requisite merit that will allow them to do the subtlest work that's the last few grounds of the bodhisattva path. But they have to do all that accumulation of merit. This is why they say if you have any desire to enter the Mahayana from the beginning, do that, because the duration of time it takes you to go through the Hinayana, abide in that state, then be pulled back into the Mahayana and make your way through that, you could have gotten enlightened long time ago by the time you achieve all that. Now again, there are people still though that need to practice the Hinayana path because they just cannot get their heads around that large of a goal. So they will eventually achieve their full potential. But I don't know the durations of these times. Actually, kind of breaks your heart in some ways. They kind of check out thinking that that's it, they've done all the work. And then at some point they have to come back and do it. Different work, a little bit different work, but...
Yeah, I don't get my head around You know, why choosing that path?
But again, it's a predisposition that they have. They may hear about the Mahayana, but they are also being taught the Hinayana, and they think that it's much more in their own view of how to manage things. And there are certain tenet systems, many of you have studied tenets, that do propound that there's 3 final vehicles, that when you get to the end of the Shravaka, the hearer path, and check out into that solitary peace, that's it. When you get to the end of the solitary realizer, the Pratyeka Buddha path, and check out into your state of peace, that's it. There's in some of the tenet systems not a teaching that you have to enter into the Mahayana and achieve Buddhahood. It's the Mahayana tenets that generally teach this, that say that we actually all have not just the potential to become a Buddha, as we were talking about in answer to Adam's question earlier, but we even have that's the final goal. And whether we achieve some more intermediate goal, we will be compelled at some point to achieve the final goal. Every one of us will ultimately attain Buddhahood. Did you recall your question, Adam?
I've remembered a few questions now. So my first question is about the self-cherishing or self-centered perspective. I guess I might call it like service to self almost, but in the end goal of being more service to others or being more bodhicitta or bodhisattva. So if you have the view that, okay, I can be service to myself, I give myself good food and a nice environment and good company, all, that's still being service to self, but you're doing that as a result of then.
Exactly.
So is that okay then at that point?
That's actually that's the bodhisattva attitude, to encourage you to, as much as possible, to do all your actions with bodhicitta. To eat your meals with the wish to benefit others, to do yoga with the wish to benefit others. Whatever it is you're doing that is tending to this body, you do it with that wish to be of service. Yeah.
And then the other questions I had were about definitions. So you mentioned arhat and foe destroyer.
Those are, foe destroyer is a translation of the Sanskrit word arhat.
Okay.
Arhat is someone who has completed the Hinayana path, meaning, again, they are that person who's attained the state where they're in that state of nirvana, solitary peace. They have completely destroyed the foe that is this self-grasping ignorance and everything that is built upon it. But they haven't done the deeper work of removing these subtle obscurations that Steph's question was about.
So those subtle obscurations, you mentioned there's 10. So
there's 10 grounds that, like I said, this is you start opening this all up and it becomes a bigger teaching. When you get to the very first ground is what you enter into at the path of seeing. Then there are 9 more grounds that are accomplished as you move through the path of meditation. And the first 7 grounds remove all of these afflictive obscurations for the bodhisattva. I'm talking about the bodhisattva path now. This is not the Hinayana. The Hinayana, they are only removing the afflictive obscurations. For the Mahayana, they remove these by the time they get to the 8th ground. By ground, we just mean a level of sequential development. By the time they get to that 8th ground and they have their direct realization of emptiness there, through the force of their merit, their positive potential, at the 8th ground, they are now facing the cognitive obscurations that they have to remove on the 8th, 9th, and 10th grounds, the final level of which is removed when one exits the 10th ground and enters into Buddhahood. So these 10 levels or grounds are just, for the bodhisattva, they are a sequential movement of removing more and more of these obscurations. The first 7 grounds removing the afflictive, and the last 3 removing the cognitive.
So is there a relation between the 7 cause and effects and the first 7? No, they're totally different things.
No. There's so many numbers in Buddhism. We use numbers like crazy in Tibetan Buddhism. There's 7 of so many things, and 4 of so many things, and 5 of so, and they frequently don't have any relationship at all. They're just another set. So okay.
Thank you.
All right, let's go to the next slide. And I really want to wrap this up and at least get through the introduction before our lunch, which is okay. We'll have to go a little faster going forward, but it's all my fault. I'm explaining too much, perhaps. But okay, so is this one the one that says arhats? Arhats have eliminated? Is that how? I can't see it from here, so. Okay, there. Arhats have eliminated self-grasping, but have self-centeredness or self-cherishing. This is what I was saying earlier, right? Bodhisattvas who freshly enter the bodhisattva path, that is, they are not arhats who later become bodhisattvas, and are below the eighth ground, have self-grasping, but do not necessarily have self-centeredness. So this is just reiterating stuff I've already explained, right? Okay? The self-centered attitude, next slide, and self-grasping ignorance also have different counterforces. So not only are they not the same mind, but they also have different counterforces. Bodhicitta, and by here he means, our conventional bodhicitta, is the counterforce to the former, and the wisdom realizing emptiness, or ultimate bodhicitta, to the latter. All right? That's it. That's the end of the quote from His Holiness. I shared it with you because if you ever dealt with this dilemma, and several of us in the Master's program debated this frequently, kind of maybe that's only what happens when you're in a 7-year program with other Dharma nerds. But you kind of get to this, well, how does that work? I mean, because in this text and in a lot of the traditional teachings, we talk about self-cherishing being the cause of all of our suffering. Well, at the grosser level, I think absolutely it is. But there is this subtler form of self-cherishing that is part of the Hinayana path, where we are mostly focused on our own welfare. And that's not really an affliction, as His Holiness says. That's not really an afflicted state. It's just a mind that is simply observing our own welfare. Maybe this is what we could even call that fundamental desire that we all have. As I mentioned in the motivation today, right, that all beings start with a fundamental desire to be happy and to not suffer. This is the starting point for all the Buddha's teachings. Well, that kind of personal drive to achieve happiness for oneself, that is what is behind a lot of our actions. And there's nothing wrong with that, the Buddha said. That is an unmistaken mind, to want happiness, to not want to suffer. Those on the Hinayana path are simply staying at that level of saying, okay, well, how do I get my happiness then? How do I get free from suffering? It's by practicing a path that removes the causes of our suffering, which are the afflictive obscurations. Whereas those who transcend that level of self-concern and move to the Mahayana have to generate a wish to benefit others. They have to become other-focused. So they see even this subtle mind of self-concern as problematic. But obviously the grosser ways that it's manifest are certainly problematic because, as was pointed out in the earlier slide, they're behind all of our negative karma. The way that we get driven to think only of ourselves when we harm other beings, for example, to get our own benefit. So, all right. Let's move on then to the last topic that's on your sheet, which is the third topic of this introduction regarding Dharma Rakshita. Rakshita, by the way, is a Sanskrit word that means protector, so we could say this is Dharma protector, this being that's known as Dharma Rakshita. There's not a whole lot of knowledge of the biography of this being, but he was one of 3 gurus, as it says on your sheet there, along with Maitri Yoga and Dharmakirti of Suvarnadvipa, or Sir Lingpa is sometimes how he's known. These 3 gurus who provided special instruction in the cultivation of bodhicitta to Atisha. You can go to the next, you went to the next slide already, good. So yeah, one of 3 main gurus. As it says there, he's also purported to have been Atisha's instructor in the literature of the lower vehicle of the Hinayana tenets at the monastery of Odantapuri in India. Dharma Rakshita was said to be a follower of Hinayana tenets, specifically those of the Vaibhashika system. Those of you who've studied the tenet systems will know these terms, but I'm not going to explain them too much. I think it's beyond what we need to know for this explanation. It's likely, though, that he was following the Mahayana path and not an actual Hinayanist. And he certainly teaches a Mahayana view of emptiness, as we'll see when we get to the slides on emptiness. So it's more likely that he was a Mahayana practitioner rather than any of these other things that are purported about him. The final point on your sheet, the Wheel of Sharp Weapons, along with the other Lojong texts attributed to Dharma Rakshita, the poison-destroying peacock mind training, are among a group of works that include some of the earliest examples of the mind training genre. Thupten Jinpa, in Essential Mind Training, says he was a person of such great compassion that he once gave away a piece of his own flesh to help someone to cure someone of an illness. So apparently he was quite a high-level practitioner, even though he may have appeared to be more of a Hinayana tenet system follower. So let's go to the final slide of the introduction, which is the structure of the text. You can go to the next one that gives the outline, and some of you may have printed out this kind of colored outline that I sent out that has the verses, kind of part of the text being divided into conventional bodhicitta, the other part into ultimate bodhicitta. I do have to say that this outline was developed on the basis of what Thupten Jinpa has in his mind training text, where he translated Dharmarakshita's text. And he took I think it's verse number 4 and 5, that we're going to look at as separate verses, and he put them in a single verse. So the numbers of the verses in different translations, you're going to find different verses. And they did a really good job of changing some of the outline to fit with that, because if you go to some of the later sections, it seems to be fine. It lines up with our verse numbers rather than Thupten Jinpa's verse numbers. But you have to change the first 3 lines on this. So if you have your written version of this, you didn't get that either. Again, all of these will be sent out. Maybe during the break we can make a copy of one of these outlines for everybody, because this will be useful to kind of watch as we go through the text, once we start actually going through it, which I hope to do very soon. The first, well, let me go through these changes when we get the outline then, so you can make them on your own version. But just know that there will be some changes to that when you get that. What we're going to be going through is first the homage. Almost every text starts with a homage. It's a very basic way that the texts are opened. Then we're going to look at conventional bodhicitta through the main body of the text, which is from verse 1 all the way through 102. And that is divided into several sections, as you'll see when you get your more detailed outline. And then we'll go on to ultimate bodhicitta, which, as I said, is towards the end of the text, about 14 verses, 103 through 116. And then a final dedication verse. So this is the basic outline of the text that we're going to be going through. So, any questions on what I've introduced people to in this first lecture? I realize it was a lot of words, and I'm sorry for those of you I may have done a lot of repetition for, but I was told that I missed this actually because I was away from the master's program when he was there, but I think it was Dagri Rinpoche who came through, and he told the master's program students, and it goes for any of us who will be a teacher if you want to teach the Dharma at some point. He said Dharma teachers aren't like the newscasters on the news. They don't say something new. And now, today in the news, the role of a Dharma teacher is to say the same thing over and over and over again. So the role of a Dharma student then is to hear the same thing over and over and over again. So anyway, I apologize, but that's what Dharma is all about. So let me introduce you at least to the title of this text. We're getting to the title. We're getting to the actual content. First, go to this next slide. Right after that, there's a little quote from Geshe Ngawang Dargye. By the way, when I received teachings on this verse, this was the only translation of the Wheel of Sharp Weapons that was out there. This one done by Alex Berzin and a few other folks. Geshe Ngawang Dargye helped Sherpa Tulku, John Landau, who some of you know. Anyway, he says in there, the essence of Lojong practice is to try to bring the teachings and the mind together. If there is a gap between them, mind the gap, right? You guys use that phrase. If there's a gap between them, the essence of the teachings is not present. Motivation is most important. So that's why, again, we really emphasize bodhisattva, bodhicitta motivation for this. The next slide. We should wish that we may apply this teaching so that we may generate bodhicitta in this life and attain enlightenment for all beings. We should rejoice at this rare opportunity. So this was Geshe Ngawang Dargye introducing this. So let's go to the next slide that introduces the title. This is actually part of the prelude to the text. It is called The Wheel of Sharp Weapons That Strikes the Enemy's Vital Point. So this is kind of interesting. In Buddhism, because Buddhism developed in India, there was a bit of a warrior culture in India, as there are in almost every culture in this world. We still have a lot of, warrior aspects in the world, obviously. So in the Indian culture, there was the use of a lot of different weapons, and so weapons are frequently used as an analogy for how we are fighting the demons in our own minds, the things that are polluting our own minds. So in the next slide, this is actually taken from Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, which, by the way, he has done a shorter commentary that, again, will be sent out to those of you who didn't get a copy. We'll make sure that that does, but it's not essential to have that in front of you as we go through this. Rather, just if you have the text, that will be enough for this. But in Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, he talks about how we could say that there are two types of enemies, because we just said that this text is about striking this wheel of sharp weapons that strikes the enemy's vital point, that is actually able to defeat the enemy, kill the enemy. Well, we have external enemies, obviously, those who harm, which are held to be the real enemy, but are not. You know, going back to even what you were talking about, Amelia, in your question, we have a lot of people who are adversaries to us, who oppose what we do, or who do things that are in contrary to, you know, what we're trying to accomplish. Those we think are the real enemies, and we do a lot to combat them, but they're not the real enemies. The internal enemies, those without form, are the real enemy, of which the principal one is self-cherishing, is the main one that's being targeted with this text. Now, I have to forewarn you that throughout this text, there will be times when, if you are looking at Geshe Jampa Gyatso's commentary, or maybe even any of the other ones that are on the book list, you might see that they'll say, oh, this is about self-cherishing, and this is about self-grasping, and others will say the opposite. And that's just because these two often work in tandem. We're mostly talking about, once more, that space where the two circles are interlocking, where we have both our self-grasping and our self-cherishing operative, where through our own ignorance as well as this strong desire to achieve our own welfare, we just keep creating our own problems, keep exacerbating our own suffering. So this is just the pointing out that we're not talking about, you know, killing other people by virtue of these teachings. We're talking about killing the enemies in our own minds. The next slide gives some pictures I found on the internet that talk about this traditional Indian weapon wheel, this wheel that was used by Vishnu, apparently. And it has kind of a circle in the middle of it that would spin, I guess, on Vishnu's finger. And he would be able to propel it, send it out, and it would be able to defeat these external enemies and then come back and land on his finger again. Well, there's kind of two different ideas for how we see this weapon wheel being used in this text. One is the fact that we are the ones, through our karma, that are sending out a sharp weapon that we think is going to defeat other people, that we think it's going to kind of get rid of the sources of our problems, the enemies outside that we think are the real problem, but it comes back like a boomerang to harm us. It doesn't land on our finger neatly, it like slices into us, it causes us to suffer. This is one of the main ways that we're going to look at this, particularly in the first part of this text, is how we have created that karma that we send out and comes back around to cause us suffering. But another way we can see it is that we are also trying to generate the force through these antidotes to send this wheel of sharp weapons out so we can come back and kill the inner enemies, annihilate the inner enemies. Because this is the goal of these teachings, is to understand that we actually can accomplish that. We can get rid of both the demons of self-cherishing and self-grasping. So anyway, I just thought I'd share that little slide about that. And then when we return after lunch, we will do the homage, and we will move into the text at a hopefully somewhat rapid rate. We'll see. I want to give enough time to all of it. We are going to, one thing that you, as a forewarning as well, is that you will see there's a couple of sections that go on for a very long period of time where there's a bit of like a refrain and a common way that they are structured. The verses are structured almost identically. It's just looking at different scenarios, different things that we are targeting. But those, I think we can go through a little more quickly because they just become different examples. We're applying a similar type of teaching, but with another example of this and that, the various things we've done or the various states of mind that we have that we want to get rid of. So any final questions before our lunch break? All right, so again, we have an hour and a half. Let's just do a very short dedication before we leave. to make sure that all of this merit that we've created brings forth the result of complete enlightenment. So think through the force of everything that I've heard, said, whatever has transpired over these last few hours. All the seeds that we've planted, may this give rise to our own enlightenment and thus the enlightenment of all beings. So we'll be back here at 2 o'clock, right around 2. So have a good lunch.